There you are, sitting at your table, a room full of guests. You've generously prepared a feast for the local landowners that you're preparing to ask for their blood and boats. You plan to inform them that after the crops are planted, that you want to send a group to raid the Church of the Dunes in West Francia. The problem is, these are the very men that have been whispering about your failing luck in secret meetings only 3 days ago. You are banking on your generosity, the unlimited mead, and the promise of mounds of silver to re-engage their loyalty. Problem is, you aren't just feeding them at this meal. You're reminding them that your storehouses are full while theirs are thinning, and their loyalty has become even thinner. You made your pitch, filled their bellies, and you think the plan has been put in motion, but 3 days later, you're dead. Not by an army, not by a sophisticated siege, but by someone who was at the party and taking note of every possible entrance, exit, and moments of opportunity. When most people hear the word Viking, they see axes, shields, and longships cutting through the mist. Then they imagine a brute force, chaos, a tidal wave of muscle and fury crashing into monasteries. But sometimes their tactics were much more subtle. In the art of war, it says, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. And the Vikings may have been almost as good at that as they were at breaking an enemy on the battlefield. The Vikings didn't always win because they were strong. They won because they were informed and they were creative. Today we're talking about intelligence gathering, espionage, spies and assassins during the Viking Age, how the North used these tactics to create real advantages. Viking Age raiders weren't just floating along in their ships looking for some random coastal town and thought, well, hey, there's one, we might as well pull over and raid these folks. No, before the raid, there was reconnaissance. And when the stakes were higher before the siege, there was sabotage. The other option that was on the table, take out the ruler, take out the king, take out the rival Jarl before the battle even took place. So let's step into the shadow side of the Viking Age. Not fantasy assassins in black hoods, not ninjas of the North, but real intelligence networks, political manipulation, strategic betrayals, targeted killings that changed the course of kingdoms. We'll explore how Scandinavian traders doubled as scouts, how rival kings were eliminated without armies, how information flowed through silver, marriage alliances, and mercenary contacts. And some of the most decisive Viking victories happened long before the first sword was even drawn. Because the truth is, the most dangerous Viking wasn't the one charging at you in a shield wall. It was the one listening at your table while you ate your bread and drank your mead. The assassinated Jarl, he talked too much. He stood near the central fire, hands wide, voice loud, boasting of dunes and silver and soft-bellied monks of West Francia. The Church of the Dunes, he called it. He described their golden vessels as if he'd already touched them. The assassin in their presence barely heard him, because the decision had already been made. The assassin sat along the outer bench, cup in hand, laying low, not drawing attention to himself. He appeared like he was listening, but he wasn't listening, he was looking. The Jarl continued to speak with greedy motives and little thought of the men he was sending on his wealth-building mission. The assassin, he was not weighing his words, he was measuring the room. The hall had 3 doors, one main entrance, one narrow service door, and one livestock passage near the rear of the home. He watched carefully. 2 old hounds near the Jarl's high seat, one under the bench near the hearth, one to the right of the Jarl's main chair. Neither were attentive with all the guests nearby, but at night would be a different story. The fire burned bright and lit the room. However, it didn't reach the far west beam. That corner sat in permanent darkness, even at full flame. Even now, if someone stood in the corner, it would be hard to tell. The Jarl's bed platform stood on a raised section behind a series of overlapping curtains made of woven wool. He could see the gap in one section, and he noted where the Jarl would lay. The Jarl laughed again, in a proud, boastful belly laugh that no one liked, but everyone gave a courtesy chuckle in return. You bring your boats and your strongest farmhands, the Jarl roared, and we will all be rich in silver. The landowners smiled, but they didn't laugh. The assassin watched their body language, and he could tell that these men were not here for silver. They were tired, and they were ready for a change, even if it cost them the spoils of the raid that the Jarl promised. The Jarl's raids had grown reckless, his demands a little heavier every year, and his generosity, it was running thin. And his luck, it was perceived as vanishing like smoke into thin air. He had lost men in 2 failed ventures the previous year, and now he needs their boats, which meant he needs their farmhands and their sons. After the Jarl concluded his one-sided monologue, the party wrapped up in usual fashion. Some men continued to drink while others left. Outside, the night air was cold and clear. The stars cut sharp above the tree line. The assassin, he walked beyond the torchlight and into the woods where 3 men waited. Landowners, they too had been at the feast. The assassin stepped out of the shadows. The men asked, "Well, can you do it?" "Of course," the assassin replied. "I'll go in 3 days, during the dark of the moon, but I'll need one of you to encourage a little extra drinking that night. You will keep him drinking," the assassin continued. "When he stumbles to bed, you walk out and you raise your torch twice. Now, which of you will go?" They looked at each other. Finally, Stig nodded and said, He trusts me. We're half-brothers, even though his family won't admit it. But we did grow up together and have drunk many times together. I'll go." Nothing was said for a moment, but the men agreed and broke the silence by holding out a leather pouch of silver. "Half now and half when it's done," Stig said. With that, the men departed, and our assassin disappeared into the forest. The night, it finally arrived. Stig approached the Jarl's longhouse carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth and a small cask slung beneath his arm. 2 slow-moving hounds rose from the dirt, their noses lifted in the air, curious. They could smell the cured lamb and the sweet, sharp scent of spiced mead. The door was wide open, and there stood the Jarl. He stepped forward, broad and red-faced, already pleased by the sight of gifts. "Stig," he boomed, "you come bearing food and drink, a man after my own heart." Stig forced a smile and stepped inside. The longhouse was alive with movement. The Jarl's eldest son was finishing evening chores, leading animals towards the small pen beside the house. 2 servant women moved quickly between the hearth and table, preparing the evening meal, while also tending to the Jarl's wife, who sat quietly near the wall. As the sun sunk behind the tree line, the work of the day came to an end. The house settled inside, and the Jarl sat at the center table with Stig and his 2 personal bodyguards, while bowls of boiled beef stew were set before them. The guard watched Stig carefully. They didn't eat much. They watched. Stig felt the weight of their eyes and tried to laugh it off. "Well," he joked nervously, "your boys sure know how to make a man feel welcome." The Jarl laughed loudly. "Don't mind them," he said. "They've been hearing rumors that certain landowners would like to see me suffer an unfortunate accident." He waved a dismissive hand and continued and said, "They don't know you like I do." Then he slapped Stig on the shoulder. "This man," he said to the guards, "is the most loyal friend I've had. We're like brothers." One of the guards finally looked up from his bowl, his eyes locking on Stig. The guard calmly asked, "Then why are you here?" Stig blinked. The guard continued, "It's late. You weren't invited. You brought your own mead." He leaned forward slightly. "Is the Jarl's mead not good enough?" The room grew quiet. Then the guard finished the thought. "Or maybe you were sent to kill him." Stig felt the heat rise up his neck. A bead of sweat formed on his brow. He wiped it quickly, but the damage was done. The guard had noticed. The harder he tried to stay calm, the worse it became. His hands trembled, and suddenly the silence became unbearable. One bead of sweat led to another bead of sweat, and the more he realized how much he was sweating, the more he sweat. And so he broke. They sent me," he blurted. The Jarl leaned back in his chair. "Who sent you?" "The landowners," Stig said, voice shaking. They want you to drink tonight. They told me to bring you mead and keep you drinking until you fell asleep." The guard stood immediately. "There's a man hiding in the woods," Stig continued desperately. "When I give him the signal, he'll come inside and he'll kill you while you sleep." One of the guards moved towards the door, but the Jarl raised his hand. "No." The guard stopped. A slow smile crossed the Jarl's face. "Let's give him the signal," he said. The guards looked at him and said, "We'll be ready." The drinking slowed, the tension filled the air, and they questioned Stig carefully now. Which landowners were involved? Why did they want the Jarl dead? What promises have been made? The night dragged on under heavy tension. Eventually the Jarl nodded towards the door. "Go," he told Stig. "Give the signal." The servant opened the door and Stig stepped outside. Cold air filled his lungs. He raised the torch, once, then twice. That was the signal. Inside the hall, the guards moved into position, one by the front door, one near the loft. The Jarl sat calmly in his high chair. The fire burned low, and they waited. 1 hour passed. Nothing. 2 hours passed. Still nothing. And now the fire was down to coals. It was dark. They were sure this would be the hour. The dogs, they slept beside the hearth, gaining as much warmth as they could. There inside the hall, it grew cooler. Finally, a servant girl whispered from the shadows, "My lord, would you like me to place more logs on the coals?" No answer. The guard glanced towards the Jarl. Perhaps he'd fallen asleep in his chair. One of the guards nodded to the servant. "Go ahead." She stepped forward, placed 2 logs on the coals, and blew it gently until the flames returned. Heat spread through the room. Light flickered across the hall. The servant girl turned towards the Jarl. She froze. His eyes were wide open, neck leaning to the side. He was in a very uncomfortable position, and he wasn't breathing. She screamed and shattered the silence. The guards rushed forward, but it was too late. There was a single wound in his throat. The Jarl had been dead for hours. They searched the house, they searched the yard, they searched the forest, but there was no assassin. No tracks, no clues, no sign anyone had ever entered. The landowners gathered the next day in a clearing where they had first met the assassin. Stig arrived nervous and pale, his voice still uneasy from the night before. He said, "Oh, sorry I'm late. Where's the assassin?" "He hasn't shown yet," Stig said quickly. "Well, maybe he was caught. Maybe the dogs barked. Maybe the guards found him." The men exchanged worried glances, because if the assassin had failed, the Jarl might have figured out who was behind it. And if the Jarl figures it out, their lives are over. Then a shape emerged from the trees. The assassin stepped forward. Stig stared at him in disbelief. "You're alive?" Stig said. The assassin looked at them calmly, and then to the others and said, "It's done." The men looked at one another. But before they could say anything, Stig blurted out, "How?" He spoke in disbelief. "You mean, how did I kill the Jarl after you told him everything?" Stig was shocked, confused, then worried all at the same time. One of the other men said, "How did the Jarl know? Who would have told him?" The assassin clued them in. "Your friend here told the Jarl everything, and told the Jarl that it was your plan. He was using this meeting to gain favor with the Jarl. My guess is he was after your plot of land." "But how could you have known that?" Stig still didn't understand. "Because I was in the room the whole time. You see, you told them I would sneak in after you left, and that's what they were waiting for. But I was in the shadows, and I heard your whole conversation. Killing the Jarl was easy. Listening to you babble, that was the hardest part." The landowners turned towards Stig in shock. Stig took one step back and said, "You can't believe this hired killer. He's probably lying about the Jarl's death." One of the men asked, "How did you get inside?" The assassin shrugged slightly. "When the house was doing chores, I slipped in through the animal pen in the rear door. I moved into the shadows. I noticed at the feast the other night that there was an area of the hall where the firelight never reached, and no one ever seemed to look." He looked directly at Stig. "But when the fire burned low, and the guards placed themselves to stop me from sneaking in, I stepped forward, tapped the hilt of his knife, and continued. I covered the Jarl's mouth, put my blade into his neck, and that was it. Then it was only a matter of timing to leave the way I came." Stig stumbled over his words. He looked at his friends. I only, the payment," the assassin interrupted. Stig fumbled for the pouch at his belt, and he handed it over. The assassin weighed the silver in his hand, and then in one smooth motion he drew his knife and cut Stig's throat clean. Stig collapsed to his knees, then fell face first into the dirt. The assassin wiped the blade on Stig's cloak. He looked at the remaining landowners. You got what you wanted. Then he turned towards the trees. And with that, the assassin disappeared back into the forest. Sounds like something you could read in a saga. But the real question is, did things like this actually happen during the Viking Age? Because if you think the Vikings only fought with spears, swords, and shields, then let's talk through what it looked like when a jarl fell out of favor or people became tired of the current leadership structure. Then we'll explore the reason we don't have more examples in history than we do. When we dig into the historical record, something interesting appears. The warriors of the Viking Age, they weren't just masters of open battle. They were masters of information. And in a world where politics were unstable, loyalties were fluid, and power could change hands overnight, information was something far more valuable than a sword. And realize this, a Viking warband didn't sail blindly across the sea hoping to stumble upon treasure. They knew where the treasure was. Before a longship ever touched a foreign shore, someone had usually been there already. Traders had visited the markets, mercenaries had served foreign kings. Scandinavian settlers had lived among the locals, and all of them carried something home that was more valuable than silver. They carried knowledge. Knowledge of rivers, knowledge of defenses, knowledge of which monasteries were rich and which ones were poorly guarded. That's one reason the raid on the monastery in Lindisfarne in 793 shocked the Christian world so badly. The Vikings didn't randomly crash into the English coast. They struck one of the richest religious centers in Northumbria, a place filled with gold, lots of gold, and had no military protection. That kind of target selection doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone is paying attention. Intelligence gathering was only part of the story, because the Viking Age was also filled with political killings, not dramatic battlefield deaths, quiet ones, jarls betrayed by their own men, kings murdered by rivals. Leaders were eliminated because they had run out of favor with the people or a neighboring clan. One of the cleanest examples from Norway near the end of the 10th century was a powerful ruler named Hakon Sigurdsson. He ruled Norway for years, and he wasn't considered a very nice man. His rule became very harsh, taxes were heavy, and his allies, they didn't like him either. As power in the region began to shift and a new leader was rising to power, a new king, Hakonsson's own slave helped the transition of power move forward by killing him. Viking politics weren't built on stable governments or long-standing institutions. They were built on reputation, success, and loyalty. And loyalty could disappear very quickly. If a ruler stopped bringing victory, stopped bringing silver, stopped protecting his followers, people began to look for something else. Sometimes that meant rebellion, sometimes it meant betrayal, and sometimes it meant a knife in the dark. Even outside Scandinavia, we see this shadowy side of power. During the struggle for control of England in the early 11th century, the Anglo-Saxon king Edmund Ironside, he fought a brutal war against Canute from Denmark. Two kings fought multiple battles, but Edmund's story didn't end with a heroic stand on the battlefield. It ended with a knife in the back following an unfruitful negotiation between Edward and Canute. To be fair, historians debate the assassination portion of the story, but the fact remains that people believed it, or at least believed it was possible, which sheds light on how assassination worked, or at least how people thought it worked during the Viking Age. Around that same time, an English king, Ethelred, he made a terrible decision. He believed Danish settlers living across England were secretly coordinating with Viking raiders overseas. They were Danish merchants, farmers, and craftsmen, but he saw them as sleeper agents. So on November 13th, he issued an order that would echo across Scandinavia. He said, kill them. Kill them all. Men, women, and children. And that day, all across England, local officials, militias, and landowners turned on their Danish neighbors. Houses were burned. Entire families were slaughtered. It became known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. Now, were all of these innocent people involved in intelligence gathering? Very doubtful. But the fear behind the order tells us something important. The English believed that the heathens from Denmark were somehow gaining access to information, which may have been a way for the king to explain why he struggled so much and lost so many battles to the Danes over the years. This paranoia became proof of Viking Age espionage, because if no one feared spies from the north, no king would have ordered a massacre to eliminate them. If you want a Viking Age example of someone who understood the power of assassination, look no further than Egil. Egil's family fled Norway during the reign of Harald Fairhair and were part of settling a new frontier in Iceland. Iceland was the Wild West of the Viking Age. He was a warrior, a poet, and someone who took things a little too personally, but he was also something else. When someone crossed Egil or his family, he didn't gather an army, he gathered information. He tracked people's routines, he watched their movements, and he hunted down his offenders and rivals with skill and precision. For Egil, this was calculated vengeance and his own form of justice, and he very well may have been the most prolific assassin Iceland has ever seen. Assassinations and information gathering were just as much part of the Viking Age as they had been throughout all of history. History books often portray Vikings as sailing blindly across sea and stumbling upon random settlements and monasteries and raiding whatever they were lucky enough to find or spot on the coast. But the Vikings didn't sail without a destination in mind. They knew where treasure was. Scandinavian traders had already been visiting markets across Europe for generations before any of the famous raids in the Viking Age had begun. This makes every Viking Age raid less random and more like an army acting on intelligence gathered by spies and informants. That would mean that they knew which monasteries to hit, which tactics were needed, and what areas to avoid due to fortifications and a military presence. The Great Heathen Army, as it was referred to by the Anglo-Saxons, invaded England in 865. It changed the entire balance of power in a land we now refer to as the United Kingdom. What challenged the fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdoms wasn't a few raids along the coast or a few burned-down churches. What brought England to the brink was an organized military campaign, and it moved with shocking precision. The Vikings didn't just act randomly. There was way more strategy involved in when and where to attack. They exploited political chaos between rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. While Northumbria was divided by civil war, the Danes attacked. When Mercia was at its weakest, the Danes attacked. When Wessex stood alone as the last kingdom, the Danes attacked. Timing, it wasn't coincidence or random. It was based on information. And where did the information come from? It came from traders, Scandinavian merchants, and people who lived alongside of their English neighbors. It also came from mercenaries who were looking for a new source of pay because the kingdom where they served was about to fall. And prisoners and slaves that escaped looking for asylum, they shared information to get it. Knowledge in the Viking world was just as valuable as silver because oftentimes that is what came as a result. The last example is from the Varangian Guard. They were an elite group of skilled Viking warriors who served alongside the Byzantine emperors as personal bodyguards. Known for their extreme loyalty and massive two-handed axe, they were the most feared and respected military unit of the medieval world. We don't have records of them being official spies, but their position inside the palace meant they were constantly surrounded by valuable information and non-stop power struggles. And there's a good chance the information they had tipped the scales in someone's favor a time or two. They were also part of military campaigns across Turkey, Syria, the Balkans, and Italy. On any given campaign, they would be relying on knowledge, troop movement, defensive strategies, supply routes, the weaknesses of the enemy's position, and anything else that would have given them an advantage in battle. And it's not far-fetched to say that these elite soldiers who were loyal to the emperor could be sent as a single warrior or a small group to eliminate a political opponent or rival. And these type of killings were most common during transitions of power or to obtain it. Now, when you start putting these pieces together, a different picture of the Viking Age begins to appear. Yes, they were terrifying warriors, but they were also traders, merchants, and informants. Sometimes assassins. All this meant was that the Viking Age was more than random violence. It was strategic on many levels. Now let's set the record straight. These are not assassin guilds, not Viking ninjas. They did not have centralized spy agencies. What they did have were fluid loyalties, traders moving across half of the known world, and a propensity for sharing intelligence with their homeland. Information came from those who traveled, and the North traveled more than most. And here's a theory worth considering. The Viking Age is full of battles, raids, and heroic deaths, but strangely quiet when it comes to assassinations. Why? Well, my theory is simple. The people who carried out assassinations didn't want to be known. Killing a rival in battle could make you famous. Killing him quietly in the night was something you hoped no one could prove. Assassins survive by staying invisible. History survives by naming names, which is the opposite of what an assassin is looking for. The second part of the theory is this. We only know the stories of a tiny fraction of the people who lived in the Viking Age. At the height of Viking power, Norway alone likely had dozens, possibly hundreds of local chieftains controlling valleys, fjords, and trading towns. Yet our sources record the lives of only a handful of kings, major jarls, legendary figures. That means that thousands of smaller rivalries, betrayals, and political killings likely happened far from the reach of what history would ever record. If you imagine a world of isolated valleys, competing chieftains, shifting alliances, family blood feuds, in that kind of environment, quiet killings would have been inevitable. The problem is they simply disappeared into the fog of time. In this episode, we learned that intelligence gathering was a major factor in the success of the North. But know this, it can be part of your success too, because it's a principle we can all use today. The Vikings didn't just rely on strength. They stayed informed. They watched carefully. They learned before they acted. That still works. So stay curious. Pay attention to what happens around you. Seek knowledge before making decisions. Because the truth is, in life, in leadership, in conflict, the people who understand the situation best usually win long before that moment actually arrives. And if this episode shed new light on the Viking Age for you, don't let it disappear into the mist. Share it with someone who loves history. There are thousands of podcasts out there, but only a handful ever reach people who will truly enjoy them. And so if you're enjoying Viking Legacy and Lore, take a moment, leave a review. It tells the algorithm that this podcast is worth showing to more people. And if that helps the stories of the North travel a little further, and it keeps the legacy of the Viking Age moving forward, and it helps people connect with the principles that caused the Viking Age to leave its mark in history, then it's worth it. So until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.